Thank you, General Campbell, and good morning, everyone. I'm Harry Radegui. I retired from the United States Air Force in 2005, and I was the director of the Defense Information Systems Agency at that time. And I've been involved very proudly with UMUC's cyber program since almost the time that I retired. It certainly has been a very dynamic and successful program for education and filling those dynamic and required resources of educated cybersecurity professionals. Now, as we've already mentioned, this is the 20th anniversary of Exercise Eligible Receiver 97. You may also hear us referring to that as ER 97 during this time. And like many of us here, ER 97 influenced what I did in the Air Force, since I also was dual-hatted from 2004 to 2005 as the commander of the Joint Task Force for Global Network Operations, one of the organizations that actually evolved from ER 97. Our first panel today will examine the ER 97 exercise itself, how it was conducted, and what occurred as a result. You can see the microphones that are on each side of the room, and if you have questions, please go to one of the microphones and the moderator of each panel will take your questions. Moderating our panel is Professor Jason Healey, and Jay is a senior research scholar at Columbia University School for International and Public Affairs, specializing there in cyber conflict, competition, and cooperation. Prior to this, he was the founding director of the Cyber Statecraft Initiative of the Atlantic Council, where he remains a senior fellow. He is the author of the first history of conflict in cyberspace, called A Fierce Domain, Cyber Conflict, 1986 to 2012. Jay also was part of the initial cadre of the Joint Task Force for Computer Network Defense, which our host here today, General John Campbell, also known as SOUP, was the first commander. Jay has a distinguished panel today, and I will turn it over now to him for further introductions. Jay?
Okay. Thank you very much, General. As our panelists form up.
I hope I'm here.
So, good morning. This is fantastic. So I'm down from Columbia, and I have to say, we do not have facilities like this, so it's really wonderful to be at such a beautiful university with such distinguished panelists. So again, my name is Jay Healey, and we really want to explore, today is all going to be about cyber at the crossroads. And I really like that title, At the Crossroads, because we are at a crossroads now, but it certainly hasn't been at the first. It's certainly not the first one. And so when we think about what the CCEI and the museum are trying to get across from what we heard in the previous discussions, right? It's about education, it's about commemoration. And as part of that, we can go back and we can look at the previous crossroads. And to me, when I was writing the book, it was clear that the years 1997 to 1998 were one of those periods in time that was perhaps the first real crossover, where we had important decisions to make, that the leaders of that time had different ways that they could take things. And it was one of the years where you really saw the most change in the shortest amount of time in that period. And it was really Eligible Receiver 97 that helped drive the decisions of which of those roads that we were going to go down. So I'm really honored to be up here with such a distinguished group. We're going to be hearing from General Minihan, who was, as you heard, he was director of NSA at that time. Had also been the director of DIA, and he can walk us through what the gameplay was like before that. Who was the players? What was the politics? What made them decide on eligible receiver and the way they did it? Then we'll hear from Captain Michael Sare, U.S. Navy retired, who had spent 26 years as a Navy cryptologist and was the head of the Red Team. And many of you are in cyber, you might know. Red Team is the people that are pretending to be the adversary. The white team are the exercise controllers, and the blue team are the friendlies that are defending the exercise. We'll hear from General Soup Campbell, who you already know. He was the J39 of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, and so was heavily involved on the JCS side and the decisions that happened, and then went on to command the Joint Task Force Computer Network Defense, which was one of the direct or indirect children from Eligible Receiver 97 and one or two other events. And Michael Warner, the command historian from NSA and Cyber Command both, correct?
No, just
Cyber Command. Just Cyber Command, I'm sorry.
Not NSA.
Who can help us think about and talk about
See you separated.
what then happened afterwards. What was the impact of Eligible Receiver 97 and how the echoes live on today. Apologies, we were also supposed to have Roberta Stempfli. Bobby Stempfli was going to be on the panel, but unfortunately she couldn't make it for some important reasons. Before we do that, we have we'll be keeping this slide up, which is some of the original slides from when everyone was briefing out Eligible Receiver 97. But first, I think we've got a short video clip from the time, and maybe we'll go to that video clip, please.
Eligible Receiver 1997 was a JCS-sponsored no-notice interoperability exercise emphasizing realistic joint contingency operations, and for the first time, elements of modern information warfare. This presentation is based on edited interviews with Navy Captain Michael Sare, the DoD Red Team leader, and Mr. Keith Abernathy, the DoD Red Team Chief Targeting Officer.
We know quite clearly how to take the DII down and how to attack the United States in an information warfare campaign.
By 8 o'clock local time Thursday morning, they no longer had confidence in their capability to mobilize and project forces to respond.
There has never been a JCS exercise devoted to IW or IO. The Eligible Receiver series of exercises are Joint Chiefs of Staff controlled. They've been going on for about a dozen years. There's nothing new there. What was new, however, was the information operations or information warfare slant on this particular exercise. The whole purpose of these no-notice exercises that the Joint Chiefs of Staff run are to improve the readiness of U.S. forces to conduct joint contingency operations. These exercises are specifically designed to exercise crisis action planning procedures on a no-notice basis, so it evokes a real reaction from the exercise participants. They're designed to exercise command and control relationships, communications connectivity, and most importantly for ER-97, the exercise just completed, DoD's relationships with other federal agencies. Planning for Eligible Receiver at the National Security Agency began in 1996. A small handful of people who were appropriately cleared into the program at that time began laying the groundwork for the IW campaign in support of JCS objectives. The timing of the exercise, the targeted sync, in this case US Sync PAC in Hawaii, and the nature of the exercise, the specific details, are strictly held in compartmented channels to support the no-notice nature of the program.
Oh, okay, then that ends.
Jay, can I make a comment?
Please.
And I should have set this up in the introduction. I forgot to. What you just saw was a 3-minute clip out of a video that the Red Team did as an after-action report from the exercise. We located this in the archives, NSA, 9 months ago. It went through the declassification process, which, if you've ever done that, that's a painful painful process. We finally got the declassified video last Friday, and yesterday worked to cut it down a little bit. So what you saw was 3 minutes of it. At the reception today, we're actually going to show the whole video. It was originally 28 minutes. What survives is 11. Frankly, what happened 20 years ago doesn't seem to be all that sensitive, but we did go through the process. The NSA folks, by the way, were wonderful in that process. We not only went through the NSA declassification, but the Joint Staff, OSD, PACOM, DISA, and the Air Force. So you can imagine how many people got to take a cut at that video. But it really is an interesting document, and what is left really does portray the degree to which the red team was able to do their business. So sorry about that. Right. I just forgot that.
No, but there's some great things out of that video. And can we put the other slide back that has the goofy eligible receiver on it? Thank you. Graphics have come a long way in 20 years. A few things, themes in that video that I think we're going to keep coming back to. When Wayne talked about the defenders lost the confidence in their capability, is I think important. The no notice that even the command affected didn't know that this was going to be happening. That it was the first exercise on IW, information warfare, and IO, information operations. And that they were still considered IW and IO. I think those are all things that I'd like to come back to over the course of the panel. But before that, General Minihan, you had been involved in this. Can you lead us off on what made you decide, in talking with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that this was the right direction to go?
Sure. So there's a cute story to build up to that. I was actually the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, had a wonderful job, and was very happy. And I was walking out of Bill Perry's door, who was a SecDef at the time. John Hamry was in there, and John White. And Dr. Perry said, "Hey, Ken, hang back a minute. I want to talk to you." And he closed the door and he said, "I want to move you to the National..."
Is that usually good news when the SecDef says that?
He said, "I want to move you to the National Security Agency." And I said, "Well, you know, I've just moved my wife twice. We're living on an Air Force base. We've got things pretty well settled. They want the way we want to have them. I don't think so. No thanks." He looks at me and he says, "That wasn't a question." And so the precept that he said, now people who know Dr. Perry know he's a very, very bright guy. He'd been on the NSA Scientific Advisory Board. He said, they don't get it. And his worry was, we were sitting on information security and a Clipper chip, a hardware solution to a software emerging industry, and we were doing line of sight against an emerging networked environment. And so he thought there needed to be a shakeup as a part of that. So the environment that I like to describe that I then end up in, independent of the fact that I was on now an Army base with an Army house, but independent of that, the environment that we went into was one where, if you think about it, the strategic context of that environment had changed substantially. We're experiencing what was known in those days as the beach party of downsizing from the Cold War. You had emerging new technologies which were networked. They were described as information technologies then. That's why you used the term information warfare at the time. And there was a concern arising that those technologies would serve institutions like terrorism, which we were not designed at that point to deal with. So there was clearly, Dr. Perry was kind of right. We needed to do something. In my view, that's the best kind of environment for the intelligence apparatus to be in. So we had a challenge, we had technology, we had people who were of concern to us, and we had leadership's interest in turning to and dealing with that. The downside of that whole discussion is two parts. One, there was no money, and NSA in this case, I'm sure you could say this for all of the institutions, we're about a third smaller than we had been 10 years before. So there's a lot that's gone at that point. And the second piece is there was no consensus in the Pentagon or in the field that this information warfare stuff, which is the way they used to describe it, was really of some consequence from a warfare perspective, and war fighters should pay attention to it. So I never left an office of a 4-star where the door was open before I was escorted through it as a part of the discussion about we ought to be thinking about funding these new technologies. There wasn't any consensus there. So the origin of thinking about eligible receiver was, how can we have an exercise where Mike Sare as the red team shows the vulnerabilities? They don't listen to us talk about it. They actually see it for themselves and create a support structure for dealing with that around that. The key person in the room at that time, as we had that intellectual discussion, was John Hamry.
Was there, I mean, what really strikes me, especially as we talk about cyber-related exercises today, was the no-notice aspect of this, which is really just incredible to me that we were doing these no-notices then, and I really haven't heard much about such no-notice exercises since. Was that important at the time? Was that controversial?
Well, it was critical because remember you had three parts. You had the no-notice, you had the build-up, then you had the exercise, then you had the hot wash. And we wanted the institutions and their infrastructure that Mike was going to go against. Mike had his both hands tied behind his back in a way. He had to obey the law, and he couldn't use any information that was classified. So it was all unclassified from the beginning, Mr. Historian. And Mike had to obey the laws doing it. Neither one of those are characteristics of the way we operate globally. And so there was all of that hybrid activity in what otherwise was going to be a very important challenge. So we wanted it to be no notice because that's the condition that the infrastructure was in. And Dr. Hamry, to his credit, agreed to that set of parameters. And then the chairman and the Joint Chiefs met and they agreed to it too.
But there was play up to the White House level, if I remember right, too. Wasn't Dick Clark the exercise president? Or am I misremembering?
I don't know what you mean by president.
Yeah.
He played the president, yes.
Yeah. Oh, he played the president.
Yeah,
Yes, he played the president.
Yeah.
Yes, the White House was in. There wasn't anyone who was preserved from participating. Again, we wanted to prove these were vulnerabilities you should care about, and you should care about them because you're not prepared, so the no notice made sense.
It's just a stunning. And at the same time, on the White House side, they were going through the PCCIP, the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection, which was 96 and 97, if I remember right. And so they were going through their own very teachable moment, I think, that this was important.
Well, remember, you didn't have there was no base of support for growing in and funding the needs that we had to do the things we were going to discover in eligible receiver. So eligible receiver provided that base of support.
Yep, that's great. Thank you. Michael, so can you walk us through how did you get involved, and then we'll move on to the red team and the scenario. And I know because you were involved in this, and not everything has been declassified yet. You've got some right and left boundaries on how you talk about it. So please.
Well, thank you, Jason. Thank you, General Campbell, for inviting me to this conference. Thank you, General Minihan, for your remarks. Thank you for inviting this cyber relic to attend the conference 20 years ago. Wow. To describe what happened in ER 97 from the red team perspective, as Jason mentioned, I'm compelled to refer to some prepared notes in order to remain within the classification boundaries derived from JCS Freedom of Information Act, FOIA responses, and select information that I judged to be accurate that was already published in open source. Thank you, Jason. I intend to fill in a few blanks within those constraints. You know, I'm struck that the last three letters of FOIA and paranoia are the same, and I'm driven somewhat by the latter. Jason.
Okay, and can you walk us through the makeup of the red team and how did you decide on your exercise, and what was the exercise scenario?
Well, let's start with how I became involved in this thing. And to answer that, I must back up a little bit. It's tough for me to pinpoint the first spark that ignited the ER 97 flame. But from my relatively low vantage point compared to panel counterparts here, my recollection is that the ER 97 seed germinated in 1996 with the idea of a cyber attack upon the United States of America as the scenario basis for a future JCS no notice interoperability exercise, long words, or NIEX for short. This was discussed in a meeting between Keith Abernathy of NSA C4, who you saw in the video with me, and Lieutenant Colonel Steve Collier of JCS J7. Next thing I knew, I recall a secure video teleconference at the highest levels among NSA and JCS leadership, and then OSD to tee things up. General Minihan was the driving powerhouse that drove ER-97 to fruition. I was brought in to serve as the Red Team leader soon after that. And if it weren't for my deputy and de facto Ops Officer Keith Abernathy, I sincerely doubt that the Red Team would have achieved as much as they did. Keith and I were blood brothers in ER-97, and we continue to be so. Composition of the Red Team, should I go on?
Yeah, and in my book, I kind of said, well, they took some NSA hackers and they let them go feral, and I don't think I get into it a little farther than that. So I suspect there's some color that you can add.
Okay. First off, as been previously said, knowledge of the Red Teams existed was compartmented with strict need to know. At full strength, the team was composed of 44 network penetration and team management professionals, both civilian and military, from across the agency, but mostly from the Information Assurance Directorate, IAD. The team grew over size. We started out with a small handful, and when we realized the exercise was going in the direction it did, we had to bring on more in order to cope with it. A key player from the IAD was Richard Marshall, General Counsel for IAD, who put into place the legal framework for the Red Team to conduct real cyber reconnaissance operation and attacks against DoD systems. Now, this required briefings and approvals from the DoD General Counsel all the way through Attorney General Janet Reno, emphasizing that the Red Team would be operating under the provisions of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act and authorities granted to NSA by NSD 42. Ironically, Janet Reno gave a green light to the Red Team. No humor on that one. Like Keith, Rich was my other blood brother for ER-97. Without Rich's work, the Red Team would have been limited to scripted attacks, which, though valid, I do not believe would have achieved near as much attention.
It's fantastic. You know, it's one of the lessons that was important to learn. So many of the lessons we haven't learned, and the importance of having a great lawyer there at the beginning when you want to do daring things. I really like that you brought that in. And the scenario?
Okay. The foundation of the exercise, as you sort of got from the slide, was built upon collaboration between North Korea and Iran as the perpetrators. The emphasis was on North Korea.
Boy, those were the days.
Their combined strategic objectives in the exercise 20 years ago were twofold. For the DPRK, to remove economic sanctions. And for Iran, greater access to the Persian Gulf together with sanction relief. There were 3 coordinated operational objectives. They were fully coordinated. Objective 1, to generate public sympathy and disgust over the impact that economic sanctions cause to innocent civilians, especially children. This was done through a comprehensive program of a PSYOPs campaign, and working together with J7, paid commercials citing the plight of hungry children and requesting donations to a phony charity we set up called Food for Children, were revealed to the blue side by 2 daily televised news broadcasts at the Pentagon called the No Notice Interoperability Exercise, or NIEX News for short. These urge citizens, in effect, to call your congressmen and senators now to lift these terrible sanctions. Objective 2, to generate public pressure for USG action to remove sanctions by disrupting everyday services and causing public unrest. And of course, more calls to Congress. This was done by scripted attacks against U.S. critical infrastructures, primarily in the energy and telecommunications sectors. These were also revealed by the NIEX News. These scripted attacks on SCADA switches associated with energy systems were demonstrated offline in a laboratory at NSA and judged to be valid by exercise controllers. They were reconfirmed again as valid by Idaho National Labs technical personnel during meetings after ER concluded. And 3, to degrade or deny DoD command and control by targeting key defense information systems. These were the live penetrations to gain access to DoD communications, harvest intelligence information for the Red Team, and sow misinformation. The Red Team left behind a textual marker file on compromised computers as harmless evidence that Kilroy was here, so to speak. Shall I go on?
Let me just, one, that we had a no-notice exercise that included live penetrations of DoD systems. To me is just, again, the kind of daring things that we did back then in exercises. And also it comes up a lot where I run into a lot of people in our field that have come recently and now are, oh man, SCADA is important now and we need to pay attention to SCADA. And so just when they say that to you, just look at them and say, I was at a CCEI event and I know that we were looking at SCADA 20 years ago and eligible receiver 97, right? It's not new. It's maybe changes our dependency. But the recognition here is not new, and the fact that DoD was doing exercises on these. I thought it was also interesting you test them in the lab, and then once you got that certified, then you could use it. So, and just in the, maybe on the constraints, and then how it went down, and then
Sure.
we'll go on to General Campbell.
Okay. Exercise constraints was painful for us. I vividly recall 4 constraints that real-world enemies wouldn't care a stitch about. First, the Red Team was authorized to touch only those DoD systems that displayed a login banner informing users that use constitutes consent to monitoring, and that included now penetration testing. Thank you, Rich Marshall, wherever you are, for our get-out-of-jail-free card. No banner, no touch.
It actually was the opposite, Mike. I told him if you went to jail, he was going with you.
No banner, no touch was a Red Team mantra. Keith, Rich, and myself monitored that closely, and there were no violations that I recall. Not all
You keep to that. None that you can recall.
I can
Good job.
recall, right.
Yeah.
Not all DoD departments put up those banners on their systems, so only a portion of DoD was open to cyber attack. General Minihan, I think, mentioned this one. Second, we were limited to using hacking tools that were commonly available on the internet. What hasn't been said is that we checked those tools before using them to ensure the tools themselves did not have any dangerous hidden features in them. If we found any, we pulled them out before we used them. No other unique tools developed by any government agency were allowed, and we policed that as well. Third, we put considerable effort in making sure that whatever action we did not further expose any DoD systems for exploitation by outsiders. And fourth, we worked closely with J7, putting into place exercise control processes that could rapidly deconflict our exercise penetration efforts from real-world activity if the need should arise to do so. General Minihan asked if we had, at some portion of our progress, asked if we had a knockoff switch or kill switch. You remember that? Mm-hmm. A kill switch procedure so that any member of the Red Team sensing that any part of the operation was out of control, we could shut the whole thing down and figure out what happened. This was a brilliant suggestion, and we incorporated that into our operations. Fortunately, we didn't have to pull the kill switch. In short, I would say, General Minihan said we had both hands tied behind our backs. It's hard to type in that situation. I'll say one hand tied behind our backs. How did it go down? All 3 of those operational attack vectors went down as planned. Now, when reconnaissance of the DoD networks began, we found a surprising number of systems that were unprotected from well-known exploits in spite of patches being available. As a result of our recon, our technical folks held discussions with the white cell controllers and blue team trusted agents, and we articulated how SIPRNet access was achievable. Upon agreement that this determination was valid, SIPRNet accounts were provided to the Red Team to allow safe access to that classified network without opening any doors that real adversaries might exploit. The cyber attacks occurred from 9 to 13 June 1997. We deployed 4 attack teams. We called them RAT teams. I think that was in the exercise slides. RAT for Red Attack Team. Three of them actually deployed. One operating out of an apartment in St. Louis, one out of an apartment in Hawaii, and another conducting operations on an actual ship at sea, simulating a ship hijacked by North Korean commandos. The teams in St. Louis and on the ship were deliberate sacrificial lambs to allow Blue Response Team to conduct live takedown practice. At the tactical level, the Red Team was able to monitor secret-level message traffic, inject false traffic to confuse DoD efforts, and translate what we learned into Red Team tactical actions against responding DoD military forces. We were given credit for those tactical actions by exercise controllers. We also hypothesized that perhaps there could be other systems connected to the SIPRNet. This provokes an image of moated castles with drawbridges, as it were. Our investigation to prove this hypothesis halted when the U.S. acting president in the exercise, Richard Clark, had had enough and terminated the exercise prematurely.
Did it ever get detected?
There were 2 detections that I recall that occurred early on in the process. In both cases, the break-ins were not detected until after our perpetrator exfiltrated the data he wanted. In any event, J7 credited these to Blue. We took down the internet account from which they originated, and we still had a wide variety of internet accounts from which to operate, so it wasn't much of an impediment to us.
So there's just so much in there that it's difficult to imagine doing today. And part of me says, well, we're not doing these daring exercises anymore. And part of me says, if we were doing that, so many of our adversaries would be riding in on that access and stay behind. I mean, the situation has changed so much now. Maybe we can go to General Campbell. So both, I think, maybe your experience in J39, both beforehand as well as how you started to see shaping, how it went down for you at the JCS and afterwards.
First time I met Mike was when the Red Team did a briefing, a road show, and briefed this, and I thought I was seeing the face of the devil because I'd been fighting this guy for weeks. In fact, hearing all the detail now, I feel worse than I did 20 years ago. So, unlike General Minihan and Captain Sare, who got involved in this exercise because of their expertise and where they were, I was sort of an accident, just bad timing. I had spent most of my career flying airplanes. I got assigned to the Pentagon in summer of '97, and I was assigned to the Joint Staff J3 as the J38 and J39. J39 we had just stood up as the Special Technical Ops Directorate. And it had basically oversight from the Joint Staff perspective of all the black programs in DoD, including information operations, which back then was a pretty sensitive area. We had just written the Joint Pub 3-0, I think, which was the information operations Joint Pub. But anyway, I was the director of that. So when the ER-97 spun up, I got a call to come down to the J3's office one Friday afternoon. And the deputy J3, two-star Army general, said, Soup, you might want to get your guys organized to do 24-hour ops next week. And I said, okay, thanks a lot. Anything else you could tell me? Nope. So it truly was, from the operator perspective, a no-notice exercise. The J39 sort of got the tasking because there really was no other structure inside the Joint Staff, any place in DoD actually, aside from the service components, to do the response to an exercise like this. So we put together an ops cell, which included folks from all across the Joint Staff, and bright and early Monday morning, I think this thing kicked off. As Mike said, there were 3 phases to it. One was the one which actually got the most attention over the years, and that were the actual penetrations of the DoD networks. And I'll talk a little bit more about the effect it had on our operation. The second phase were these simulated outages in the electric power grid across the country and the 911 phone system. It was all simulated, but the way that played out for us at the receiving end of this was every evening we had, it was a 5-minute simulated, like a CNN news broadcast that detailed riots and rolling blackouts and dissatisfaction over sanctions and the psychological operations campaign that Mike mentioned. So it was very realistic. We had a NIAX early bird, if you recall back in the day, that when we had the early bird, the news clips, that was done every day. And so you had a very realistic play from the PSYOPs piece of this. The penetrations have gotten the most news over the years, the most attention, but the other part of the exercise really was interesting. So we played this thing out. One of the clips in the video, which Keith Abernathy mentioned, was that at one point the blue forces had lost confidence in their information systems. As I recall, that occurred because there was an actual operation. The special ops folks were going to do an actual assault on this ship out in the ocean, and at one point there was an execute order that was issued. The red team countermanded that order and sent this false order out. So it completely confused the blue team operation, and that was the point at which we said, hey, we have something's in our system. We've lost confidence in our ability to command and control our forces. And of course, all this was in the exercise play. It didn't affect the real world, but you can imagine the effect that had on the blue forces. So this thing played out. I think it was terminated after short of the actual time. As I recall, they actually did allow the SOF folks to do the takedown of the ship because that was one of the training exercises. But we had learned enough and seen enough in the 3 or 4 days it went on to realize we'd achieved the objectives. So in the aftermath of this, the J-39, again being the only place to go, got the action to do the hot wash and the lessons learned. I had my guys working for a couple of weeks. We put together all the lessons learned. General Pete Pace was the J3, and we brought General Pace in and began to do the briefing and quickly realized, we should have realized earlier, we had a lot of actions, but there was no one responsible. Who do you task these things to fix all the stuff we had seen? Because there was no place in DoD to go to fix the things that we had seen. So the big observation, the one that really got the ball rolling, was the observation that within DoD, no one's in charge of cyber defense. No one's in charge of detecting, assessing, attributing, and coordinating defense against a cyber attack. That set in place a lot of activity over the next few months. John Hamry was the DepSecDef. He hopefully will talk about this in his remarks. He was the top cover for this. The Director of the Joint Staff, Admiral Denny Blair, and Vern Clark was the J3 at the time, provided the top cover. So we spent about 3 or 4 months trying to figure out what kind of organization do we build to take on this role, what are the doctrinal underpinnings of it, and where should it reside. Shall I continue, or do you want to?
Well, let me ask one follow-up. So the response within DoD during eligible receiver. So as DoD was saying, something bad is happening to us, how do we respond? So you had the services, you had the commands, you had the Pentagon generally in the JCS. How did that work? Right? How did that information flow, and who was making decisions? Who was teeing up those decisions?
Well, that's a good point. In point of fact, there really was not a central authority to take all this information in, put it together, and make an assessment of what's going on. As you well know, a big part of cyber defense is attribution and assessment. What does this mean, and who's doing it? And it took quite a while to figure that out. We were helped a little bit by the fact there was explicit exercise play that gave us clues about what was going on, the 9/11 attacks and some of the world events that were simulated. But a lot of this we just put together because of the limited amount of detection we were able to do. And it was really a painful process.
Yeah. So when I was going through some old slides on this, I thought I'd say, was it IORC, the Info Ops Response Cell or something like that?
Yeah, the Information Ops Response Cell was something that the J39 had set up, and we probably made a mistake in retrospect because once we set that up, we became the target.
Yeah, all right. And so that was kind of the initial germ that became the Cyber Command. And Michael, you had a two-finger, and then I'm going to go to Michael Warner.
Well, I'd just like to, excuse me, I'd just like to comment on one thing you mentioned about the reacting soft forces. Yes, there was a message to put doubt in the minds of those forces, but once we had credit for that, the forces did continue because they needed to be exercised.
It was an exercise training.
In the exercise.
Yeah.
One remark I'd like to caveat as speculation. Given we knew that there was a reaction, and given we knew there was an ATO, an air tasking order, associated with that reaction, well, speculation, I would say we should be able to react to that and meet those forces in time. End of speculation. Thank you.
Yeah, so, and whenever you think you've got a cool cyber exercise, if it didn't include an actual special forces takedown of a ship in the Pacific that had the hackers on it, you don't have a cool cyber exercise. So the other lesson, so we've had so many, and we were talking about this a little bit last night, we've had so many wake-up calls, and yet afterwards it doesn't seem like the lessons got learned. Michael, I mean, you're the command historian. I mean, is this remembered? What things did you see that changed in the big terms, in big history that came from this?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being patient.
No problem. As you can see, it was very nice of former Secretary of Defense William Cohen to provide the sheet that's in your packet here. This is a very nice recap, and he touches on much of the ground that I want to cover, so I can go over it a little bit faster and a little bit different light there. I mean, I wish the historian could task a former Secretary of Defense to provide something like this for you. We can't, but it's very good here. Eligible Receiver 97 is part of a continuum of how you recognize a problem and you come up with a solution for it there. People in the computer industry, people in academia, people in the services who are maintaining these systems, known for a decade or more that we had a problem, known that we had serious vulnerabilities. The problem was getting other people to recognize this, getting the White House to recognize it, getting the Joint Chiefs of Staff to recognize it, getting the services to recognize it. And so Eligible Receiver 97 is a tipping point for that. It is a way and a time in which you get a lot of people focused on the problem there. What comes next, of course, is the concept of a solution, and this falls to General Campbell to come up with the solution. And now people are sort of feeling their way in the dark. How do we figure out what to do about this? And the first problem is the first thing to see is that no one's in charge. Someone has got to be put in charge. And so from that, in 1997, 1998, you see a series of decisions and you see a series of recognitions and assignments that follow from that. And you can see many of these in that tape that we saw earlier there. That's a wonderful, timely declassification there. And in the remarks that you've been hearing from the stage here. The idea that we have to do this in a joint way, that the services buy all that equipment and they put the networks together and they find out ways to network the networks together there, but who's in charge of defending it? That has to be done in a joint way. The idea that it has to be done that a commander's networks are like a weapon system, like a submarine. They have to be fought like a weapon system. This is the idea of net ops that gets instantiated in the Joint Task Force Global Network Operations in 2004. The idea that that we're only going to be able to defend these things if we've got good access to the intelligence and the people with the skills to operate on the networks. That means NSA. that idea gets instantiated later on, and that comes with Cyber Command in 2008. The idea that we can only turn these insights into our own attack capabilities gets instantiated as well. You can sort of see this from eligible receiver too. So all of these are antecedents leading up to Cyber Command, which Secretary Gates conceives in 2008, directs in 2009, and is finally created in 2010. And so what you see here is a time lag between the recognition of a problem, followed a year or 2 or 3 years later by the concept of a solution, followed a few years after that by the assignment of authorities, and finally followed by an organization to implement those solutions. And you can sort of see that over and over again in this process here. So eligible receiver is a key moment in pushing that process along there.
Jay, could I comment on
please, and I think also Gentleman Hand
on the actual process of deciding on what sort of structure to stand up was a hard one. And again, without the top cover of Dr. Hamry and Vern Clark and Admiral Blair, it probably wouldn't have happened. But we went through. We knew that doctrinally it had to be correct, or the services would not go along with it. And there was a lot of resistance in the services to the idea of some joint organization that was going to have visibility and directive authority over their networks. That was not something that they signed up to easily. So we spent quite a bit of time looking at the joint doctrine. We finally came up with the construct of a joint task force, and that helped with the optics with the services, because a JTF by nature is a temporary organization for a specific mission. So they kind of went along with that. As you know, in joint organizations, you have a headquarters element, and then you have service components that are assigned to it. So the authority that the headquarters, our JTF, is going to have over those service components was also a big issue. And we finally settled on tactical control, or TACON, which in the doctrinal world means you have the authority to issue directive orders to accomplish a very specific task, but not to change organization or organize, train, equip. Those are service functions. So we sort of put that together. The services didn't like it. We had several tank sessions with the DEP-Ops Steps. Again, thank goodness for Admiral Blair and Admiral Clark. But the services finally did agree. The next issue was where to put this thing. Once we finally decided on a JTF, I personally at the time thought that DISA, Defense Information Systems Agency, was probably the right place, because they were in Washington, they were close by, they had visibility over the networks, they were experienced in network operation, and they had the technical capabilities to man this thing. DISA, frankly, didn't seem to want the job. Every time we talked to them, they kind of pushed back and said, well, we really don't have the resources, don't have the money, don't have the space. On the other hand, the Air Force really did want the job. They were down in San Antonio at the Joint Warfare Command and Control Center, or
Command and Control Warfare Center, GC2C, yep.
And in fact, we took a team down to see their presentation. They actually had a mock-up of an ops center with the current ops desk and the intel desk and this, that, and the other. And so that really made it play for it. That really scared the other services. The idea of not only having this organization to look at their networks, but that it would be an Air Force organization really was going to be a high bar to get over. We were a couple of days away from taking the final recommendation to the tank, and Lieutenant General Dave Kelly, who was a director of DISA, called me up at home, and he said, I've been thinking this over. He said, I think DISA is the right place. I'll build an ops center for you. I'll give you X number of people. I will assign the Global Network Operations Center, the NOSC, GNOSC, as a component to the command. We'd be glad to have you. I suspect, and this might be something to ask Dr. Hamry or maybe General Minihan, he might have gotten a call from somebody from the third floor of the Pentagon. Don't know that, speculation.
And so curious how cyber history would have worked out in the U.S. if we would have started in San Antonio rather than at
Yeah, that would have been. So anyway, that's how we ended up with the concept of a JTF. Again, I always thought it'd be a temporary organization. Mike can probably trace the lineage from that, but there's a clear trail from what we started with evolving names and evolving missions up to today's Cyber Command. And that was really all. We knew it should be eventually the job of component commander, and it went through Space Command and then Stratcom, and now it looks like it's going to be its own.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen.
So I would just add a couple of thoughts to, first, it's better to be lucky than good. And I was really lucky that they picked a good guy like Mike to run the red team, because Mike was out of no man's territory for a good 2 months. And so when I grabbed Rich Marshall, I said, Rich, you know, you lawyers usually hang up on the third deck and tell us what we did wrong when we're done. So that's not happening this time. You're down there with those guys on watch, and if they do something wrong, you're going to be responsible for it. And so Rich was really a prototype of a way to operate in the future, which was to have the lawyers there. Soup got stuck in what at that time was, if you knew anything about these technologies, they were so highly classified you didn't have two other people in the room that you could share it with. So Soup was stuck with, how do I operate in an open environment with a set of closed technologies that no one can be really is aware of them, and he made the bridges that ultimately came at. The way I would shift in this discussion here is to just share with you, so what does NSA do after eligible receiver becomes important? And I told Dr. Perry, I said, I want to own the technology engine room. So I want Fort Meade to be where that occurs. So when you decide you need a cyber center of excellence or a cyber command or whatever you're going to call it, you're only going to be able to put it one place, and that's at Fort Meade, because that's where the technology is going to be. And so the decision taken at that point, you know, has turned out to be, when they started having discussions about where to put Cyber Command, I said, you don't have a choice. Go ahead and look around all you want. But at the end of the day, the technology's at Fort Meade, ha, ha, ha.
And what year was that initial decision? So that was 97? And
Coming out of eligible receivers. So if you go back, you'll find information operations technology centers, you'll find toolboxes, you'll find all of the technology base, and we even started our own R&D platform to do that. But it was a Fort Meade oriented thing, so it was understood it would be shared. It just was a question of how long it took the institutions to decide they needed something like Cyber Command in order for that to work. And when they called Dr. Perry into the White House to say, what do you think about Cyber Command? His speech was, you can only put it at Fort Meade, because that's where the technology is. The last thought I'd share at this part in the discussion is you've toyed a little bit with the notion of the only exercise. It was stunning that we never ran an eligible receiver in Cheyenne Mountain, because there's your national footprint, there's the responsibility for these technologies, and to this day, when you look at the charters do not include cyber attacks on the nation. And the reason they don't is nobody's ever had an exercise where they did to Cheyenne Mountain what Mike did to the Department of Defense.
And I'd like to call out, you talked about the IOTC, the Information Operations Technology Center, which have the toolbox. There's been some publication on that, people like Bill Black, Larry Strang that were key in that. And so lessons, what lessons do you think were most important? Obviously NSA is the center part for that technology is important. Are there any lessons that you thought that we didn't learn, that we saw that moment and you feel like it was a missed opportunity?
We today still struggle with the problems of vulnerabilities, which we've known for years and years and years, and we don't close on them. So I like to tell people, I'll go get you a paper written in '97 if you want to know how long we've been at this. It drives Dr. Hamry crazy when I give that part of the speech, because nobody wants to hear. They really haven't. But to this day, we have not tended to the shared vulnerabilities between the critical infrastructure, between the government and in the commercial entities, so that we can deal with these vulnerabilities. We wouldn't have to worry about the Russians or the Chinese or any of the other ones that we do.
It frustrates me a bit, even as Cyber Command has been elevated, as I say, who's in charge at the end of day of making sure that everybody patches? And that used to be an easier decision, I felt, and now I think because you've got around, that's just been such a lesson for 20 years, and it feels like we have difficulty learning it. Mike, you had a two-finger, and then I've got...
Well, you mentioned lessons learned from eligible receiver. I could mention a lesson that was only half learned or mislearned from eligible receiver. Remember that the adversaries in eligible receiver, and it's interesting now we can talk about this, are Iran and North Korea, but they're rogue states. They're almost it's conceived of as a terrorism problem, which is why Richard Clarke, the terrorism czar at the White House, is the fellow playing the president there. We're not thinking about state adversaries yet. We're not really thinking, gee, is somebody out there with a lot of motivation, a lot of resources, who can put a lot of attention to this, going to attack us in a systematic way, as opposed to a bunch of Farsi-speaking script kiddies or something like that, which is sort of the nominal red team in the exercise here. It really isn't for another 8-9 years that we're thinking in terms of state adversaries. So that is something that is a missed opportunity in eligible receiver 97.
And I'd like to go through and just to see if there's any other, because we're going to close out today with talking about future. I mean, so between the next panel and the panel after that, what are the kinds of, what do we think from this that we need to be thinking on? I'm going to lead into that with a little bit, and then we'll go to the questions with the mics. In the video, Wayne and Michael talked about information warfare and information operations. And we talked about that for about another 5 years after this. And then we switched to talking about cyber. And many of the most important attacks that have been happening on the United States in the last few years, the cyber element have been pretty minor compared to the influence elements. The Russia hacking the elections, even Sony was less important for the hacking than for what was done with the information. Do you think it was maybe a missed opportunity that we didn't stay on the information operations and information warfare? Are we, by creating a cyber command rather than information command, is that something that if you could go on back, we might have done that differently? And I'll look to the two generals, and then again, we can go through it for final comments.
So I yield the first move to Soup. No pressure, though.
State the question again, Jason, just I'll make sure I've got my head
So
around
this
it.
was an IWIO exercise
Yeah.
and include a psychological component.
Yeah.
Around the time we did JFCCNW, I would contend that we stopped worrying so much about IO and IW, and we were all about the cybers.
Right. Yeah.
And I recently wrote that maybe elevating cyber command at this point is like elevating a battleship command in 1935, right? Is it really the right command for the right kind of national security threats we're going to be facing, or have we focused it too narrowly?
Well, I think...
And this is getting, I don't want to get too much into the futures
yeah,
panel, but rooting it in this.
Again, I think going back to the roots of J39 and how we got involved, the reason we did was because of the IO connection in J39, and we sort of thought that cyber was a piece of IO.
A piece, yep.
IO actually is a lot bigger than just the cyber, of course. It's the whole range of perception management and influence operations. Cyber's a small piece of that. It's a tool, but I think we've now realized that the cyber piece is probably a bigger problem, a bigger issue than IO. And it's only if you had the Venn diagram, yeah. I think the overlapping parts should be
right.
Small.
So to build on that, essentially I was there for that fight. And what happened was we come out of eligible receiver, we start to build the infrastructure out in the Air Force at Kelly. We decide to have an Air Force Information Warfare Center. Now the thought police show up over the term Information Warfare Center. Yeah. And that's how information operations gets its leg. That's how the definition that Soup was sharing with you starts to take hold. Next thing you know, it's psychological and all that other crap. And we lose complete focus on the real strategic technologies that are at our doorstep. And so if you look at it in that context, when we use the term cybersecurity, we're dumbing down a concept that should be security in the cyber age. And by handling it as cybersecurity, we always get a more narrow discussion, and it begins with the thought police over information warfare. So now, if you're coming along, you don't really know what I mean when I say cybersecurity, because I just mean cryptology. If I say security in the cyber age, I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of other things that are available to me. That's what, my words, that's what the larger geopolitical structure that should be put in at Fort Meade should be a global cyber center of excellence for all of those things.
Okay, and we'll start going to the mics, but Michael and then Mike, any last thoughts and start thinking about future lessons?
Well, a couple things. I was remiss when I mentioned the 2 valid detections of the red team. I was remiss in mentioning another thing that occurred during the exercise that was a real credit to blue. There was one Marine Corps network operator at Marine Forces Pacific that saw something on his network that was unusual. Because he saw that, he took action to tighten his firewall so that he could only communicate with people he knew were trusted. He really locked it down. When he did that, we couldn't get in anymore. Credit to Mar 4-Pack.
And I think that points out there are some important TTPs that we can do, right? The network can be defensible, but it is hard, and it takes people doing the right thing.
Yep. Very quickly on the information operations, should that be something with cyber, or should cyber be under that, as it was for many years there? This is a theological, doctrinal debate within the Department of Defense. The latest iteration of it was the Joint Pub 312 that came out in 2013, declassified around the same time, so you can find it online, where this is where cyber comes out from under information operations. That is now being revised. It will be a little while before you get an approved copy and a declassified copy of that, but you can follow this through the evolution of these documents right here. The position I would take is that cyber would not have matured if it had remained part of information operations, because information operations is such a much broader thing, including military deception, psychological operations, operational security, electronic warfare, and so forth. It had to be given some space to mature, although it could be folded in a different way back into it at some point in the future.
Great, thank you. I've got a response. If people want to start coming up to the mics for your questions, thank you. While you're doing that, I will continue to ask a question. We had talked a little bit, Solar Sunrise had come immediately after. So these incidents were in June 1997, Michael had said. Solar Sunrise came up just after that. And so I'd like to come back to that. So Prime and first up on the mic, we've got Larry Castro.
Hi, Lynn Wells. Just to Mike's point here on the recombining, splitting of I/O and cyber. I think Admiral Studeman's made the point that maybe we have separated the technical parts of cyber too far away from the information content parts of whatever I/O with the other disciplines, and maybe it's time to put them back together again, not unlike the Russian radio-electronic struggle or something like that. Just be interested in the panel's view on whether it's time to put them back more closely together again.
Netmar reintegrating back to IOIW? Cyber and content. Yep, thank you.
Well, there will
Thanks,
be some of that as cyber becomes an elevated combatant command. There are aspects of IO authorities that can come to a unified combatant command that Cyber Command does not have as a sub-unified command.
Yeah, I would agree with it. I would push it a little farther. My argument would be the one I just shared with you. It's security in the cyber age, and those things that go together in that, to include what Bill's talking about, are the things that ought to be all under one. And we have an infrastructure that allows us to do that at Fort Meade. If you look at Fort Meade, as opposed to NSA, Cyber Command, DISA, and the industrial base, if you look at Fort Meade, we're punching way below our weight in topics like that, where we could put them all in that context there.
I'll just go back to my example of Venn diagram. It seems to me that there are some synergies between information operations and cybersecurity. I'm just not sure that overlap is that great. It seems to me we don't have a problem there. But
and for me, certainly Department of Defense ought not be lead on content and things psychological and the rest. I always thought it was an interesting idea that we might consider, since we already have cyber mission teams that have area experts in them, you might have cyber influence teams that are matrixed into the existing mission force that are looking for when our adversaries are using cyber means for influence campaigns such as the Russians. It's relatively easy to matrix them in. And again, you don't want necessarily DoD lead, but we've already got this great framework with the Cyber Mission Force where you could do that. Maybe those are at Fort Meade, maybe those are out at the regional commands and integrated with the, I don't know if we still have JICs, but whatever is happening in the regional commands. But that strikes me as a nice, easy thing to do that probably only costs you a couple million and is a decent first step.
It might be helpful to think about, I mean, we've divided up the cyber world into defense, attack, and exploitation. To me, the exploitation and attack piece are tools that are part of the I/O toolbox.
Yep.
Things you can use as cyber access to influence our adversaries. To me, again, I would separate out the defensive piece of that as perhaps a separate piece.
Thanks for the question, Dr. Lin.
I am Jesse Varsalone from UMUC. My question is, which operating systems were used to carry out the attacks? I imagine that's Windows 95A and possibly Windows NT Workstation or maybe Solaris. And based on my experience with all of those operating systems, except for Solaris, they're very unstable. When you attack systems, they become unstable. Your own system becomes unstable sometimes. So if you could talk about, operating systems have come a long way in 20 plus years. So talk about a little bit of that, perhaps.
Soup, I think that's over to you. Just kidding, that's you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that.
Well, without getting too specific, and I know you're looking for that, again, the red team used systems that we expected that were commonly used by attackers. And I'd like to just leave it at that. But I'd like to add to that what we found in order to gain entry to the targeted systems commonly was unpatched systems that should have been patched. The question comes up every now and then, well, did you guys find any zero-day exploits that no one would have known about? No, we did not. We didn't focus on that at all. We didn't need to. The doors were open.
And
I would make the point that going back to ER 97, I remember when I was vice director of DISA and the JTF commander analysis, and even recently I think the Equifax problem, the real problem is our unpatched systems. There are vulnerabilities which are well known and for which patches have been issued, just haven't been installed. So yeah, maybe some are zero-day exploits that are used, but I'd say the majority of these breaches are just due to operator error.
I always wondered if one reason that DoD was so bad about thinking about software flaws is that we got so deep down the rabbit hole of network operations, and that we so became focused on network operations that we forget at the end of the day it's about the actual computers and the vulnerabilities in them in many cases.
Well, can I just say something
Yeah,
just before you walk away from the mic?
Oh.
I would be careful about the premise that I thought you were suggesting, and that we do better software now than we did back then. That is not the case. And so we're as successful today as we were back then, exploiting the vulnerabilities of our software development process.
Great point. Thank you. Here and then over to the other side.
Hi, I am Balakrishnan Dasharathy, Professor and Program Chair of a Cybersecurity Program at University of Maryland University College. So this is my question. The first major denial of service attack took place in 1974 by a student from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. The first major internet worm attack, the Morris worm attack, took place in 1977. So why did it take another 10 years before this study was conducted to understand our own vulnerability? In other words,
Yep. Great
It's
question.
only done it 10 years prior to that, we probably would have been in a slightly better shape. So I'm sort of curious. It took about another 10 years to know, hey, this might be needed for our own cyber infrastructure. Okay, so I'm sort of curious for somebody to realize that 10 years have passed before something bad like this could happen.
Great.
So that's the question.
Yep, start.
Historically, what happened in those 10 years?
Mike?
Sure. What happened is everybody in the entire world went online. I mean, this is the 1990s, the mid-1990s are kind of a pivot point. Before then, computers are, they're big mainframe systems, or if you've got little terminals, you've got your Commodore 64 or your IBM XT or something like that, and it's not online. The people who are online are people in the computer community, and they're just like not normal people, and people don't talk to them anyway. I mean, they're overgeneralizing a little bit here, but it's when everyone goes online, everybody becomes dependent upon it. In the mid-1990s, then it becomes a global, a universal issue. This is when other countries start looking at it. Former Warsaw Pact countries start looking at it. The Russians and the Chinese start worrying that they're hooked to the world economy through the internet now, and they need to start thinking about this. The saliency of it goes up dramatically. But you're absolutely right. William Gibson, the fellow who, the novelist, the sci-fi novelist who coins the phrase cyberspace, he says in an NPR interview somewhere, he says that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And the future was already there for people in the 1970s, as you said. It was just held in a very small place. It gets distributed. ER97 is a key moment when the dam breaks and that distribution, as it were, spreads all over places where people can make decisions about what to do about it.
And I think there are two other inflection points that were important. The Morris worm in 1998, after which DoD said, we've got to have a computer emergency response team at Carnegie Mellon. The Air Force cert comes out of that. The DoD Assist, which Bobby Stempley, who we're sorry we missed today, was running, and you needed to have that prior. And then I think also the Gulf War in 1991 that got everyone, they got the senior leadership focused on information operations, and that took it out. That helped make information operations become really real to get up to this point. And then I think more on this that we can talk this and the previous some of the other questions. Hopefully we can talk over the networking socials.
Hi, good morning. I'm Adam Tanverdi. I'm a student here, a master's program for cybersecurity technology, also a former Air Force SOF aviator. So it's interesting that tidbit of information that you gave about how SOF was.
And can you believe we haven't brought up the Air Force and Navy game yet? Can you believe we haven't done that? Oh, and Bill Gravel's not even here. Okay, go ahead.
Right? You don't need to talk about it, right?
Was there a game?
Good game.
So, but I
Go ahead, Adam.
The
Thank you.
panel's sharing that little bit of history as far as that part of it. Didn't realize it in the read up to this. But my question is focused on the people aspect. I think the captain brought up a good point at the end there that you mentioned that it was a Marine person out in PACOM who noticed there was something not right on the network. And I just think it goes to show how important the people are in identifying these issues, because you're never going to be able to patch everything. You're never going to be able to defend every node. So I think that's interesting, and it sort of leads to my question about, first of all, the takeaways from the exercise. Was there a takeaway? Because I think you see it in other forums, that this discussion about we need more people who are trained in these areas, we need more resources to go to getting people educated and in the workforce. So I wonder if that was if the panel could comment on that, if that was one of the lessons learned, and I guess maybe comment on if they've seen any improvement in the future, particularly with regard to training folks, and then also making sure that although we're moving down the road of becoming more automated, how do you integrate people into that automation process? Because automation, again, may not catch everything, may have false flags. Maybe speak to that a little bit, the importance of the people as we move forward into a more automated, more connected.
And I'm going to take the other question, and then it'll probably be the last question, and then we'll go on from there. You want to go ahead?
Yes. First of all, thank you, panelists, for a really, really fascinating and insightful discussion. And my question is about one particular lesson learned, which is balancing the risk of maintaining essentially obsolete systems in your network environment versus the reward of not having to spend money to replace them. And I don't know to what extent when you were doing your red team exercise you found any obsolete systems that you could take advantage of, as an attacker would naturally try to do. But do you think that moving on 20 years from then, we're actually doing a better job, and I'm thinking specifically about the federal government and the various branches, including DOD, of getting rid of obsolete systems, getting them out of the environment, spending the money necessary so that the networks can be more protected?
Thank you. Why don't we start with Michael on that, and then we'll go through. So both on the how are we doing in the risk trade-off and taking out obsolete systems, and then Adam's question in the role of people and kind of lessons learned that we've done from that, and we'll use this to close out your final.
Okay. In response to your question, one of the recommendations coming out of our outbrief from the Red Team perspective was the balance between the need for technology and people training to use that technology. In the Marine case, here we had a guy that had technology, he recognized something was wrong, and he tightened the system down to prevent it. Bravo. And so we talk about the need to get our people to be able to understand and use the technology in response to whatever they're faced.
So I'll just to add that, so think of it a little differently than the way you talked about people. What NSA needed to do is populate industry with information assurance expertise that didn't exist before, because most of the critical infrastructure was in industry, not in the Department of Defense. A part of that manifestation is in this room today, where we funded UMBC for it to develop a curriculum. And I remember the first 20 institutions that were in my office, and we told them, you're each going to get a chair, and here's what we'd like that chair to do to develop. So there was a broad set of actions that occurred around people in order to develop that. And today, you see almost an engine room of folks coming out. My worry is the engine room is a little more intellectual and a little less operational than it ought to be. I'd like to see a fairer fight at the point of attack than the one that exists today. And so I'll give you the dumb answer to the question about eligible receiver. I got the Marine story, and I've heard that. There was one institution which just pulled its router from the exercise and then came back up on the net after the exercise was over, clean and green. And so you may be making this a little harder. If we ask the troops what to do, they probably have solutions right now.
On the Red Team, we called that a self-inflicted denial of service.
Yeah.
And on the, are we doing better in taking obsolete gear off the network?
I mean, I don't know how to think about that. So I would say it's less about obsolete gear. I'm worried more about what I would describe as the rate of change to new things, which exceeds the pace of patching and security and so on and so forth.
Yep.
That needs to, I use the term trust, it needs to give you a trusted network as opposed to a secure network.
And it's one of those that I suspect that Rob Joyce, when he's here this afternoon, will talk about, because to me this is a lot what EO 13800 was trying to do and move towards shared services, of saying, look, we need to centralize a little bit more, we need to go more to cloud, we need to go more shared services, which I think picks up on a lot of these lessons.
Jay, can I give you one factoid on the personnel thing? When we got the approval to do the JTF, obviously, money and people have to come from somewhere, so we had to scratch for every person. Our initial cadre was 24 people. And we were operating in trailers out in the parking lot of DISA. We actually had about 40 people because many other organizations, including the law enforcement and legal community, said, hey, we want to be part of this. So they contributed people, but 24 people to start with, and I'm not sure what Cyber Command is today, probably 7,000 or 8,000.
No, not quite.
Whatever. The answer is, though, there's an insatiable demand for trained, operationally proficient people, and we got to grow them someplace.
Yep. Final thoughts?
The key people question, I would say, is who understands the risk involved, who understands what legacy technology is there, who understands how fast you're patching, who understands how to make that happen, and is that person responsible for making decisions, accountable for making decisions. We constantly say that cyber is commander's business. It's not an IT shop thing that is done in the basement. It has to be something where the commander himself or herself knows the risk that's involved in these decisions versus that decision and so forth. And being able to put all that together and understand how the mission will get accomplished or will not get accomplished with certain risk decisions. We need to push that out, and this is part of the direction that we're driving the force in.
Yeah, and that's very parallel to what's happening in many places in the private sector where they
Sure.
say this is the board's responsibility, enforcing that board conversation.
Absolutely.
We didn't have as much time as I would have hoped to have talked about how eligible receiver then led into Solar Sunrise. And many will have followed Solar Sunrise because it was a real-world incident that happened in February 1998, about 8 months after eligible receiver ended, and it left. And because the military had just gone through, and White House had just gone through this exercise, they were primed to be ready for a response to Solar Sunrise. And what I really liked about this panel, and what I really like about the CCEI and the museum, is that they're keeping these discussions ongoing so we can look back and look at what are the lessons that we can pull from them. I found it very frustrating that in this field I would often find many leaders that would say, well, this didn't really start going until 2008, or maybe they'd say 2005. Basically, whenever that person got involved in cyber was about when they thought that the department really started to take it seriously. And in fact, I've found a disregard for the history of saying it's changing so much, it's so technologically driven, there's really no point in looking back. And what we hoped that you'd get out of this was that the lessons that were learned, the things that Michael went through are extremely similar. The technology might have changed, but the basic things that Michael was doing, the basic decisions that the generals had to go through, were extremely similar to the ones that we're doing today. And yet we've got, if you're at a war college, you're going to go out and you're going to learn about Cannae. You're going to walk the battlefield at Gettysburg. You're going to think about Jutland and say, if I were in this position, what would I do differently? And in this field, we haven't taught the history. We, in fact, told people it's not important because it's changing so quickly. Mm-hmm. And so what we really wanted to lay in here is we're at a crossroads in 1997 and 1998. Because of the dependence, because of the technology, because of what we knew our adversaries were starting to think about. And so we want you to take from here some of what happened in those years, why we took that road down eligible receiver that then led us down the path, an easier path towards where we are today in a cyber command, and also to take away the lessons that we didn't learn. Patching is one that obviously is staring us right in the face. If we knew these things that they went through 20 years ago, why is it that you're going to hear in almost every other cyber conference that you go to, leaders that are coming out and talking about the same problems and the same issues, and we're trying to apply, I think, relatively same solutions and expecting a different result. So please take away the challenges from this, both in what you hear about here, through your educational careers, and for the rest of your careers overall. Please thank our other panel. And I think now...
Good job.
Well, thank you, Jay, and thanks to all the panel members. That was an absolutely great overview, and it reminds us of where we were 20 years ago. And I'm glad now that we have officially documented that great historical perspective from the ones who were there, the ones who lived it. So thanks to UMUC for doing this. We're now going to take a 15-minute break, and our next speaker is Dr. John Hamre, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense during ER 97. And he will be giving us his perspective. His name has already been mentioned numerous times. And so please plan to be back in your seats by 11 o'clock so we can stay on schedule. Thank you.